Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to This Is an IT Support Group. We're joined today by Ben, head nerd at Enable. Say hi, Ben.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me back.
So, for those that don't know, today we're going to be talking about MCP, and I guess Ben, I will just jump straight into you. And do you want to tell the audience kind of what MCP is, for those that actually don't know by now, and then we'll just go into the questions from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So MCP is a new trendy acronym on the block. I mean, I say new, and in AI terms, it's probably not that new anymore, but it stands for Model Context Protocol. And there's a weird magical thing that happened in the industry, which is kind of one of those, almost once in a lifetime things that everybody sort of decided on a standard for something very, very quickly. What an MCP server does is it sits as a bridge between the API, the product underneath, and an AI agent at the top. And this kind of sprung out of AI agents have been around for maybe 2.5 years, 3 years, something like that, when they've started getting to the point of actually being competent and able to do things for us. But the early versions of those things were kind of knowledge sourcing agents. You gave them information and they went and did something. What an MCP lets you do is it still can let you do the knowledge sourcing, but it allows you to interact with different tool sets. And we were kind of having this world where we had OpenAI, we had Anthropic, we had Google with Gemini. They were all sort of coming out with ways for connecting their LLM, their AI agents to other technologies. And rapidly it became apparent that this thing that Anthropic actually originally invented called an MCP server was a good way of providing a standard platform for doing that. And Anthropic actually ended up open sourcing it, making it available to the broader community. And I think I've said this before elsewhere that I try and find an example that doesn't make me feel very old, but it's kind of like, we had HD DVDs versus Blu-rays, and we had Betamax versus video versus whatever, through the history of technology, we've always had competing standards. And weirdly, this time, everybody seems to have settled on MCP as the standard mechanism for AI agents to interact with tools. So I can carry on, but that in a nutshell is an MCP.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. I guess so. We'll jump into the first question then. So, I guess, why do we need another mechanism, as you put it in quotes, beyond
Yeah.
existing APIs? So, is an MCP server the same thing as an API? What's the difference there?
So it's an abstraction of an API. So if you imagine you have kind of a pyramid or a stack where you would have an AI agent at the top, that is the thing that is programmed, is able to go and deal with kind of broad ranging questions across a bunch of different data sets and a bunch of different tooling. The tooling down at the very bottom layer of the pyramid is the API layer, where we're very used to go and find me this information about this thing and come back with a result. An MCP sits in the middle and it bridges the gap so that the AI agent doesn't need to know the finicky detail of how to interact with the API. And the API doesn't need to, have many, many different ways of being published for an AI agent to be able to access it. The MCP sort of sits in the middle and makes that simpler. So an example that I've given before is if you at an API level, if I want to find out the amount of RAM in a computer, I need to say to the API, get me the RAM value for this machine. And that could be a bunch of IDs, whatever, to nail that down. But you make a query to your API and you get a response back. An MCP server is an abstraction from that. So you could say, get me the specifications for the machine called this. And the MCP server has a layer of intelligence to it that knows what I mean when I say a machine. It knows what I mean when I say specs. The specs for a computer would be free disk space, the amount of memory, the type of CPU that's in there. That's what an MCP lets you do. And an AI agent sitting at the top talking to an MCP, you could say something like, help me plan a migration strategy from Windows 10 to Windows 11. And it would know through the MCP that it has an MCP to maybe enables backend, which has information about the machines that, are reporting into the enable platform. And it does the thinking about like, well, therefore I need to get the specs. So I'll ask the MCP. I need to find out from Microsoft what the specs are to upgrade from 10 to 11. And it helps you strategize. So it's a way of incorporating data sets in a friendlier way than having to hard code, queries out to an API that is a very specific thing. And when the API changes, you and the AI agent don't need to do anything because the MCP server should be the thing that is changed. And that knows like, hey, I've got a new tool set that I can go and access. The AI agent, when it queries the MCP, says, tell me what tools I can play with. And it knows there's a new tool that is defined usually in some form of sensible natural language, so it knows what to do and how to use it.
Yeah, perfect. So would you say that maybe MCPs could make APIs easier for agents to understand and maybe even use safely?
Yeah, using safely is a gray area, right? Because it's like, how safe is PowerShell? PowerShell, if you have permissions and you have the right command, lets you wipe your computer. It lets you wipe 30 computers like that. An API will let you do that. So an MCP isn't the thing that gates the security or the sensible use of whatever the tool is. That relies on, the same sort of stuff that we have around permissions, your access levels, the actual capabilities underneath. What an MCP lets you do is understand what the capabilities or the capacity or the remote endpoint is without having to fully understand the API itself. And then also weirdly, I play a lot in the Microsoft space, so I've done a bunch of building with Copilot Studio around creating MCPs and connectors and things. We're almost at the point now where you can, if a product or tool has a really good documented API, but they don't have an MCP server, you can pretty much go and vibe code yourself a bunch of connectors that will go and talk to those APIs and deal with stuff for you to then use that in your AI agent as well. So it's crazy days.
Yeah. So I guess that then leads on to, why do tools actually need to be discoverable by these agents? So what is that link now that we're, obviously in the age where everything is becoming reliant on AI? It's speeding up people's workflows, it's speeding up the connections between APIs and actually enhancing how quickly, as you say, if there isn't an existing connection, it's probably not too difficult to go and vibe code one for yourself.
Yeah.
Why do tools need to be discoverable by those agents? What is that?
Because things change, and it's supposed to be a mechanism for allowing you to discover in real time what the capabilities are from whatever the thing that you are talking to. So it's supposed to reduce some of the friction around, and this comes back to kind of the security aspect in a little way, I suppose, of being able to discover a new tool or a new way of interacting with something without having to go and re-architect and retool your entire stack. You have an MCP server this is dealing with my device type queries. When you ask the agent to do something, it will connect to the MCP, it will see what tooling it's got available, and it will then pick one of those tools to come back. Now, this is where there is responsibility in the instructions and in the usage of telling the AI agent how to talk to that tool around what kinds of things you want it to do, and sometimes you can steer them specifically for use this tool for this job if it's not necessarily obvious. But an MCP server that's been well designed, it should be obvious from the tool name, and there is a description included with the tool in natural language that the LLM can read and process in natural language, whereas an API can be very, very obscure. It doesn't need to be machine readable in that way. You just need to know that it's this endpoint with this particular command with this structure that I use, whereas the MCP can kind of help abstract that a little bit.
Yeah, I guess a follow-on question from that then is, why does tool discovery actually, I guess, how is it important compared to like manually hard coding integrations? What's that? I guess we've said it's already, its efficiency is one thing.
Yeah.
But well, I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
It's simplicity of use as well. So like an example is I'm building myself a personal agent for dealing with how I run my professional life, right? So I in Copilot Studio have built myself an agent, and I have built, actually it's an architecture using sub-agents. But those sub-agents that have MCPs for Microsoft provided ones for talking to my email, talking to my calendar, talking to my to-do list, talking to my knowledge base where I've got kind of reference material and all that sort of stuff. And I have very simplistically defined, like, when you want to know about a thing, this is where you go and talk to it. I haven't had to get down into the nitty-gritty of this is how you write a note, this is how you create a task, this is how you move a task, this is how you prioritize a task. It's let me at a higher level sort of speak to a person, almost like I would speak to a person, to say, this is how I'm defining what I want you to do. I want you to go use this library book over there when you need to do a thing effectively, and it then goes and does it for me. Whereas if this was not through an MCP type interface. I would have to be a lot more specific about do this way, use this for this circumstance, this way. So it's that, AI is inherently squishy, and an MCP matches the squishiness of an AI agent in the top and the defined firmness of an API underneath.
Yeah. So I guess for those watching, I'm sure you've got a lot of experience with this by now. What does a good tool description actually look like so an agent can understand and when and how to use it?
Yeah. So it would be this is a debate that I've been kind of involved in a little bit recently as well, around like, if you're writing spec documentations for software, how do you define a spec for a person versus how do you define a spec for a machine? You have to be careful about being explicit and filling in the blanks, because we know that AI agents they don't like not giving you an answer. They inherently can't not give you an answer. So in your specs and your definitions, you need to be careful about consistent terminology and being sufficiently descriptive that if you give it to a person who doesn't understand what's happening, they would be able to understand it as well. There's this kind of assumption with using AI agents that they are magic in some way, they read minds in another way, so it's just, don't be too verbose, but also don't be too minimalist. So a description would be, use this tool to return a list of all of the devices in your infrastructure. It needs to have this criteria and this criteria as an input. It's that kind of level of a thing that you would be looking for in a description.
Yeah, so I guess that then leads on to, I've got one a little bit about access control. So how can, maybe in the context of a business, how can we kind of think about access control when agents can discover and use these tools that maybe, we've just written descriptions for them? I guess we'll get onto the guardrail specifically in a minute, but
we may bleed over to that in the answer to
this.
Yeah,
I'm sure we will. Yeah, but maybe I'll just skip on to how important are those guardrails around the use of MCPs and those AI agents?
So as much as I've harped on about an MCP has become an industry standard and is a good mechanism for doing this, one thing that hasn't been standardized in the same way is how you authenticate to an MCP. There are broadly three mechanisms, and we'll get to the guardrails point. Bear with me. There are three ways that you authenticate. One is you have no authentication, you just have an open-ended one, and you might think, why on earth would I want that? An example would be the Microsoft Docs has an MCP server. If you're ever building an agent about something to do with Microsoft, that's incredibly handy, because you just put that MCP in and then it will know, like, oh, I'm looking up something about Microsoft, and it will go and read the official documentation. Great. But we don't care that that's an authenticator, because we're not doing anything other than just consuming that that content. The second one is that you would use some form of an API token, and there are mechanisms to include the tokens in the headers, usually of the messages that you're sending to the MCP. And the third one is around OAuth, where you do a challenge and a response and you authenticate with your credentials. Now, those tokens and authentication mechanisms with OAuth, you are providing a level of access to whatever the backend system is in the same way that you would using the API. You're not necessarily giving more permissions. It is my user context, my service account context, my API user account context, whatever that context is, has access to the data on the back end. So the consideration there is exactly the same as with an API. The difference, I suppose, is that with an API, you are specifically saying, run this command in this way at this time, whereas an MCP is a little bit more open-ended. But this is where the guardrail stuff kind of come in, that what an MCP, and if you're building your own AI agents, what it lets you do is you have greater flexibility to combine these tools in different ways that you want. So an example could be you combine the Microsoft Learn Docs with the Enable MCP, with a Service Desk MCP, so that when a ticket gets flagged, an agent can go and automatically look at the information about the device pulling out of our MCP. It can go cross-reference that with the Learn Docs to find out if there's anything happening. You could maybe have an MCP that looks at the change roadmap for identifying, did something change recently in the tenant, or whatever it may be. You can combine all of these things in a weird, wonderful, unique color palette to maximize whatever you want. But it's your responsibility for how those things are running and operating. The same way that with a custom devved program with an API access, you're responsible for how you use that API. But the difference there is versus, say, an in-product AI agent, where in the enable stack we have a tool called Ask Enzo that is our AI agent in the tool. That is completely different from a responsibility point of view in how you use that, because the responsibility is on us to make sure that it does the thing you want it to do in the way you want it to do. When you're using the MCP, the responsibility is more on whoever is configuring and using the agent that is calling the MCP. Now, there are mechanisms to work around that. Things like we have a read-only endpoint. So we actually have three. We provide a preview endpoint, we provide the sort of standard public roadmap and public endpoint, and we have a read-only endpoint. And the read-only endpoint is the same as public, but it's missing any of the mutation capabilities. So it doesn't let you change stuff or run something. So you can consume a read-only version while you're building confidence, while you're checking that it's okay. If you only ever need to report on output data, use the read-only one. But that's that's our mechanism that we have. Other ones that are out there, you can then control it inside wherever you have built the agent with your instructions and your guardrails that you build into your instructions, but you're relying on the agents to obey those instructions explicitly.
Yeah, I guess one thing that just came into my mind there is, how do you stop those agents from taking actions that, technically are allowed, but maybe contextually wrong when you're writing these descriptions or when you're, building them
Testing.
in?
The only answer, unfortunately, is testing and testing. If you don't have that kind of read-only capability, it is being consistent with your terminology. And that's where have you heard of a thing called CATMIP? CATMIP is something that Nicole Reinecke from our side is running, but is open to anybody across the industry. That is a way of defining what terminology is being used when. So what do we mean when we say a device? What do we mean when we say a client? What do we mean when we say an agent? Because they mean different things in different circumstances. The agent could be an agent in a contact center that is a human. It could be the bit of software running on the machine that is reporting back, could be an agent. It could be an AI agent, an LLM running somewhere. So it is very important to be careful with your language. But then it comes down to when you're building and developing your AI agent, being careful with your instructions. There is a balance between being too specific and too defined, and too negative, because sometimes with LLMs, if you tell them specifically not to do something, it's kind of like you've put it top of mind for them, so that maybe they do then do that thing. So there's a balance, but ultimately, this is where it's agent design and agent creation. It's making sure you're testing your agent, making sure you're being careful with how you do stuff with it. Some of the agent builders out there have specific capabilities in them for being able to test the functionality of an agent. So you can say, I want to ask this question, and this is the kind of a response that I should get back. And then as you build your agent, you can rerun that test set to make sure that you're not creeping or you're not changing. And another kind of little side thing worth mentioning is, even when you're building these agents and the models change. So again, in Copilot Studio, the world that I know most about, Microsoft is introducing Opus 4.6 as an agent LLM that you can use. So it's on 4.5. They're giving you a period of time to migrate from 4.5 to 4.6, because you need to retest, recheck, make sure your instructions are okay, etc., etc. That it'll translate. It's not kind of just as simple as swapping the brain out, because they do, they do respond slightly differently. So it's not a new problem. It's not an insurmountable problem. It's just it's a reframing of a problem we had before, right? Because PowerShell versions would change, scripts would change, stuff changes. It's just making sure that you're being cognizant of that and able to plan for that.
Yeah, and as you say, that goes straight off the back of what you said originally, which is testing. And when you change language model from 4.5 to 4.6, there might be something, whereas you program something internally, what has changed specifically and what those changes are going to reflect on. When you're changing language model, there's so many variables that could possibly change an answer or an outcome of an agent, that the only thing that you can do very stringently is test and make sure that all of those things react in the way that you want them to after changing that language model. I guess that kind of links into what we were talking about with the guardrails, though, is, what sort of approval steps should exist? Obviously testing is one of them, before an agent maybe takes a more sensitive action. And that kind of integration there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's not something that the model of having an MCP sort of supports specifically, that you can't at a tool level say you must confirm this action. It's kind of like the API that you call in and it does it. But my personal little agent that I'm messing on with, I have guardrails in that, as in when I tell it how I'm, when I do my daily task review or weekly task review, I make suggestions about this task needs this deadline, this needs to move into this section. I've put something on there for reference. I want you to go and pull down a copy of that web page, and I need you to file it. But I have in my instructions that before you make any changes, you come back to me with a proposed plan and I approve it specifically. And I haven't had a problem with it not doing that yet, but it's making sure you have those kinds of things in it. The sort of phrase that I'm starting to hear a lot more is human in the loop. You want to make sure that you have the human in the loop, that you present an output, you present a suggested action, and then the person has to confirm, yes, I want to do that, for it to go ahead. So it's a design thing around how you instruct your agent and how you build it. And back to that, if there's read-only endpoints, use those while you're testing, while you're making sure, etc.
Yeah, so I'd say for maybe small organizations or individuals that are new to MCP, what could make is there a risk that could make it too easy to connect AI to sensitive systems before maybe they're ready for it? Is there any kind of guidance you would give to those kind
Yeah,
of?
I just think about it. It's the same risk reframed that we've had through years and years, right? Like there's the problem with AI systems and solutions. It's the same as when Copilot got turned on inside organizations. It's the same when Delve back in the day got turned on inside organizations. That suddenly, you know, security through obscurity was no longer sufficient, that a particular document or bit of data was hidden somewhere. If you have permissions to it, AI made it super easy to expose that and make it visible. Same thing applies to the MCPs and AI agents, right? Of like, you can hook these tools up in such a way that you could automate everything, but you have to understand and think about the inherent risk of doing that. And this also comes back to that authentication against your MCP. Like, don't necessarily, depending on what your system is, give it an API token or an authentication that has access to do absolutely everything you want or think you might need. Start slow, start with kind of minimal permissions so that you can understand how it works, the way that it behaves, what some of those edge cases might be, and then kind of build it up from there a little bit. So it's the age old thing of just stop and ponder, and don't just rush into it. And it's incredibly easy to get carried away with just going and building these things, because part of what they do is make it so incredibly simple. But yeah,
Yeah,
be
yeah, that's
careful.
a great answer, and that's the same with anything. Before you expose it to a production environment and it's something new, you test it, make sure
Yeah.
it's actually relevant for your organization. And there's also a comment here from Richard, and he says non-deterministic behavior should not be allowed around processes or data which impacts customers, which I guess is a fair enough statement to make, right?
Yeah, it is. And this is where it's your appetite for risk and your understanding your responsibility around it. You could build some incredible automation workflows around things like device management and ticketing and solutions access and all that sort of stuff. You could let these things loose to do everything and anything you want, but you do need to make sure that you have sufficient auditing and logging, and have taken into consideration edge cases where stuff's happening. I mean, we've seen kind of recently in the media one or two things where it's like, oh, oopsie, we deleted a whole backup. Or I saw someone yesterday on, I think it was Reddit, they were trying to diagnose something through Claude on a machine, and they'd run a PowerShell command, but the escaping of the quotes around the particular part of the C drive they were trying to clear out had got lost in translation somewhere, so it like wiped out the entire C. But it's
Oh,
ultimately you still gave it the access and told it to run the thing. Like, the human in the loop is the way forward. And yeah, like, if it's something that's impacting customers at scales, you need to be pretty sure that you've got robust processes to manage what it's doing and roll back if you're letting it do it.
yeah, and we've got another comment just before we move on to the next question here from Brannon, and he says, "I'm interested in knowing when an MCP is necessary versus having a skill actually defined."
Yeah, so there's an interesting kind of overlap with skills and MCPs. Skills tends to be a little bit more, this is how you go and do a thing. So, this is how you convert a Word document, or this is kind of the workflow that I want you to use when we generate a certain kind of report. I need you to do this kind of research and get this kind of data and format it in this kind of an output. That is more what a skill definition is, whereas an MCP, and they do overlap weirdly. We are seeing a little bit of not a swing away from MCP, but some people saying that MCPs aren't necessarily the future for how these things work. And I'll come on to my opinion on that in just a minute. But you do see some stuff that is very lightweight or very fixed, may be better as a skill. It's more a defined way of doing something, whereas an MCP is back to that. It's slightly squidgy, and it's deliberately slightly squidgy because you're abstracting from the hard tool underneath from the AI agent on top. The reason people are being cautious with MCPs is they can have a very high token cost. So tokens are the mechanism that inside an LLM where they have context, that every time you have a conversation with them, that conversation is taking up a certain amount of tokens based on roughly the amount of characters or words that you are using. And again, depending on which LLM you're working on, so say Claude, when you're typing into it, every time you have a backwards and forwards conversation, the entire stream of that chat goes back to the LLM for it to pass through and process before it comes back. That's why you'll see it sometimes stopping and saying it's out of context, and it will compress the conversation. That basically means it's throwing away some of the information that you've told it, and it's deciding what information it thinks it should remember. So be careful about that. Sometimes it is best to say, summarize where we're at, give me the highlights, and then take that into a new chat to start over. But from an MCP point of view, the discovery, the process of going and connecting to the MCP, identifying the tools, calling the tools, can have a relatively high token cost. So some things that are very simplistic, maybe it is better to have a skill or a basic connector that does a thing in a very defined way. But if you need a little bit more freedom and dynamicism around it, an MCP is still the better option. I think longer term MCP, the freedoms of an MCP and what it lets you do is better. I think we're seeing a problem with MCPs being very heavy and usage heavy from a token point of view for now, but it's kind of like computing back in the day, that problem got solved by processors getting faster and then being able to be more capable. I would hope that over time, and there's all sorts of real world complications and issues here about data center availability and a whole bunch of geopolitical stuff that's going on there, but hopefully over time the cost or the credit cost around tokens and what have you will become lower, that it does become less of a consideration for MCPs, because the abstraction they provide to me is very beneficial.
Yeah, and I mean, we literally had a comment come in as you said that, saying MPI credits are expensive. But I guess, as you say, it's with technology in general. If we compare the amount of compute power when we went to the moon for the first time, it just shows you how quickly technology moves on. And something that might cost be quite costly today, in 6 months' time or even 3 months, knowing how quickly AI is progressing at the moment, it might not even cost a fraction of that. So
no, exactly. And this is where we don't know where we're going to end up with things like local LLM models that can run say offline, but you do have some capacity for running locally on MPUs or what have you. Again, then the cost of connecting to an MCP becomes negligible because you're not paying kind of the big price for them.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess then we'll just move on to kind of the last question, or second to last. But
sure.
Using MCP services unlocks the ability for anyone, as we were just talking about, to build their own agents. And what are the main considerations here versus using an in-product AI?
Yeah, so it comes back to that responsibility. That an MCP is giving you the ability to go and connect an AI agent of your choosing, using an LLM model of your choosing, to the backend tool sets that the MCP exposes. And you can combine those in as many ways as you would like. An in-product AI agent is kind of like, we were talking about skills being a very defined way of doing something. An AI agent is, hopefully an in-product one, is tuned very specifically for, this is the data that I have access to. these are the things I'm allowed to do for you. This is how I approach doing those things. And the guardrails around, are you sure you want to retag those machines? Do you definitely want to create the script? This is what I think the script looks like. The human in the loop checking, all of that kind of stuff is the responsibility of the vendor who has created that in product AI agent versus an MCP. Is you are the developer that is consuming, that MCP service. So the responsibility is on you, versus in product it is on, the vendor and the whomsoever's product and agent you are using. And it depends on the in product agent. There's the sacrifice of the flexibility there, that you can't necessarily combine those up with other tools and other agents that you can with an MCP. I said, I was playing around through my Copilot Studio. I've got, my one agent has about 7 different MCPs in it, because I don't care about the price, because I'm paying my M365 Copilot license. So it just, it sits there and it goes and chugs through and does what it wants. But I've got these all combined in a unique way for playing around in the way that I want. And that I like that freedom and that flexibility. It's great.
Yeah. So would you say that we're heading towards a world where every SaaS product kind of exposes an MCP server, or what do you think is going to happen there?
It depends. I think there's an issue around what data you are going to have access to and what capabilities you're going to have access to. And there's going to become issues around billing for how you get access to those things. And that comes back to, well, whose data is it you're dealing with, and in what way? Because I was having a debate with someone around Microsoft, and I think it was access into one of the Microsoft, not MCPs, but their search tooling. And they're like, well, but it's my data that's sitting in there in my mailbox, and I want to be able to access it. It's like, well, it is fine, yes. And you can, for free, go and access and pull out a search report. But then they're adding capabilities that will join the dots across your email and smartly connect entities of this document to this email to this person to this thing. That's something that is a layer of additional processing and compute and cleverness, where they're adding value. That is not just you're paying to access their data, you're paying to access a clever thing. So will most SaaS products end up with MCP? It depends what their product is and what it does. But if you go and look out there, you look at things like LinkedIn scheduling platforms. A lot of them have MCPs now. Web scraping, MCPs available. Enable and other device management platforms, MCP servers, because people want to be able to pull that data out, report on it. Things like password managers I would imagine would start having MCP servers in, but that's a very different consideration from a compliance and an access point of view. You would need to be very careful about what access does that have through an MCP server. Like, where am I going to present that? And you also need to think about, another layer that we haven't discussed is, it's fine that I've built my AI agent, and my AI agent has access into whatever the tool is with an API token that I've configured. But where am I accessing that AI agent from? Is that only from a secured internal device? Is that from a mobile device? Can I access through the web? How am I sufficiently gating access to my AI agent on the web to make sure I am who I say I am, that is then using that tool? So again, it's it's all just things to consider. I'm being very consultancy with, here's lots of problems you should think about, but you need to think about them without giving any answers. But it's the world now, right?
I mean, that's the thing, and not everyone's use case is going to be the same. Not everyone's environment is going to be the same. You can't give one answer to thousands of people. And there's someone else who commented specifically, as you just mentioned, password managers. Do we accept that these AI agents have access to our 1Password MCP and will hold us hostage later on? It's like, it's dependent.
I'm sorry, Dave. I changed all your passwords.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't do that. So that's the thing, isn't it? It's just, we have to assume, security.
But like that answer for your 1Pass MCP, what is your use case for being able to programmatically access your MCP server? Because in a hard-coded world, pre-MCP, pre-AI agents, having a password vault is significantly better than having files knocking around on a shared folder in CSVs or, a notepad or whatever it may be. But then why do you need programmatic access to that? Is it to be able to change and update those passwords? Or actually, is it to be able to audit those passwords? Tell me the last person who accessed this and how many times they did. That kind of an information through an MCP would be really good, because then you could, as part of a leaving process, you could have a go, whatever the leavers joiners process would be of decommission the account, go and check against the one pass MCP. I don't know if this does this. The password manager of choice is MCP server, and tell me which were the last 20 passwords that they accessed. And then we know that we need to flag those for review, etc. So there are use cases where that kind of thing could be incredibly handy. Tie that in with our MCP server. They were logged in on this device at this time. These are the machines that you need to decommission or make sure that you get returned. It's incredible, the kind of use cases. But would you want to have that MCP server being able to programmatically change all of the passwords in one fell swoop, or delete all of the passwords in one fell swoop? No.
Yeah, and I think that's it doesn't have to be access grants everything. If it was for that use case, you could specifically grant access to potentially, depending on the API endpoints, logging only of when was this password last accessed, not the content of the password that's hashed.
And that's back to the access you're giving to the MCP versus the capabilities the MCP actually exposes in the way that it does. It's you need to not look at it as a one size fits all, but look at it as what are the capabilities and how can I leverage them, and how making sure it's the good old days of least privilege, making sure you're not over leveraging them.
Yeah, so I guess we've kind of touched on this already, but for smaller businesses, maybe say an MSP, is MCP something that they should care about today, or is it something that's more of an emerging developer-focused concept? You mentioned it improves your workflow, and you've had a lot of experience through Copilot, so clearly it depends on the use case, right? But I wondered what you think about that.
I think it would be if you're exploring using LLMs, which I would imagine most people are, right? It's what are you using them for? Where are you finding the value in them? And then looking at, is there a way to enhance that value or take it in a slightly different direction to get more value using something like an MCP? Because an LLM is as good as kind of three things. One is the actual LLM itself, how it was trained, what model it is, how much deep thinking it does, in air quotes, around the question. Then it is how good a question you ask it, making sure that you're giving it enough information to get the answer that you want in the way that you want it. But the third thing is the data that it has access to, and that is what an MCP can change. So that a base LLM only has its internal training knowledge data. The most basic of ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude have access to the web, right? So when you ask them a question, they will go and do a web search to come back with information that they then pass through and give you a response. That's kind of how an MCP is working, is it is giving the ability to pull information or interact with information in another location and pull that into the conversation, into whatever you are doing. So if you're playing around with AI, you've maybe looked into AI agents. If you've looked into AI agents, you should probably be having a look at skills and or connectors, and connectors are generally either API-based connectors or MCPs. And that would be look at, what vendor products are you using, what solutions are there out there. Most will have some flavor of an MCP available. The other challenge is it can be technically very complicated to connect to an MCP. But again, we're getting better with instructions and standards for how to do that. But that's where things like ChatGPT, you have to put it into developer mode specifically to add custom connectors. That's because they're being safe around vetted connectors and vetted things. In developer mode, you're saying I'm taking the guardrails off, and I'm responsible for this. Claude, generally most people will play around with MCPs inside Claude Code because that is running on your computer. It can run like a little connector to go out and talk to whatever it may be. So if you're should you be using these things? Do you need to be using these things? No. Should you be aware of them, and should you have a little experiment? Should you find a very simple use case to do something clever with it? I think so, yes, because the penny might drop and it'll open up a world of understanding what the capabilities are for as these things improve, as your business needs change, how they might be able to help meet you.
Yeah, and I think it's just one of those things, isn't it? You don't have to be at the forefront and be one of the leaders of cybersecurity to just be aware of what's in the landscape, and that's just another contextual thing. It's should you be aware of something? Yes. Do you have to use it right now? Not specifically,
Yeah.
but just be aware of it. And I think that's a well-balanced answer.
And it's very stupid example, but I also do a lot of home assistant, home automation. I found before I'd done any company MCPs, any enable MCPs, I found there was an MCP server for home assistant. I installed it, I plugged it into Claude, and I just had a little play. Like, this automation didn't work right. Can you tell me about it? And it just blew my mind that it was like, oh well, I can see your logs and chunk 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 chunk. This happened at this time and this here, and I'm going to change this automation for you. Is that okay? It was one of those unlocking moments of like, wow, this is actually, this is incredibly simple, but also, could be incredibly scary. Just be careful with what you're doing. But it's find a little safe thing to go and play with, and just play with it, just so so you can be curious, so you can understand how they operate and how they work, and what sort of stuff might be possible.
Yeah, and I think that's just one of those things, isn't it? Contextual AI really exposes how much something could improve your workflow, could improve something in your life. It's one thing talking to a chatbot about a specific scenario, which most people have got experience with by now, but actually incorporating it into some sort of due process or API endpoint, you can really start to see how this is going to possibly improve and enhance your workflows. So
watching the dots connect themselves.
Yeah. We just had one comment, and you kind of touched on it already. Nathan says, I wouldn't recommend a single agent having access to both internal and external areas, especially because you could download something bad or accelerate data on accident. I guess that's true. And
but that's the same thing of like being careful about what you are connecting where, and where people are able to access something. For like the exfiltrating data, it is very valid. Like if you had an MCP, an agent that was built, to talk into our MCP, you pull out data about all your computers. Once it's in your LLM, once it's in that agent, what's going to happen to it? But then it's the same as being able to download a document over the internet. Do you allow that? What guardrails do you put in around that? Because once it's on someone's machine, they can copy and paste it, they can take a photo of it, they could get that data elsewhere. So it's an interesting split that, do you have an agent that is a customer focused, customer facing agent? Do you have an agent that is your internal? And this is back to the guardrails thing of like, for you as an MSP, should you be looking at building one super agent that's able to do all the things and all the customers all of the time? No. Do you want an agent that a salesperson could query to say, give me the current status of tickets and the device estate, but isn't able to do any manipulations? Yeah, because they could run that 10 minutes before they walk into the meeting with the customer to just get an idea of what the current state is in a nicely formatted out report. But someone on the service desk would have the agent that is able to actually maybe generate some scripts, or maybe interact in a more meaningful fashion. So again, this is that design, thinking it through. What are your use cases? Don't try and kind of one size fits all it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And I guess just for those that are watching, to close up, if someone only remembers one thing about MCP from this stream, what do you think it should be, and why?
They're very cool. They're very powerful. You want to have a little play with them to understand how they work, because this is only the direction of travel, whether it's an MCP or something else. This mechanism of being able to connect multiple different data sources into an AI agent is where this stuff is all going. So have a little play, and I think
wonderful stuff. So if anyone listening wants to contact you about anything we've spoken about today, where can they reach out to you, and how can we continue the conversation?
So my email is ben.lee@n-able.com, or LinkedIn. I end up posting quite a lot of stuff on LinkedIn around, more specifically, the Microsoft roadmap around things. Obviously the enable side of stuff as well, but I'm more than happy to have conversations on there as well. So Ben Lee UK on LinkedIn.
Wonderful stuff. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Ben, for joining us again.
Good stuff. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.
Have fun. Bye-bye.